very excited to have her here today. We will be talking about her upcoming mission to the ISS station, and she will tell us all the details about her mission and also about her life and whatever question might arise from the public who's watching. So I'm really excited today to have her here, and welcome, Samantha. And how are you today?
I am very well. Thank you very much for inviting me to this hangout, and I'm looking forward to talk to you and everybody who's listening. Welcome, everybody.
Thanks. Where are you now, Samantha? Are you in Europe or are you in the United States?
I'm in Europe right now. In fact, I am sitting in a room at the European Astronaut Center. That's a facility in Cologne, where we as European astronauts are based. So whenever we're not in training in Houston, or we're not in training in Moscow or in some other place in the world, this is where we work and this is where we train.
Great. And what can you tell us about the mission that you are preparing for? What is going to be like? I know it's going to be in November 2014, right?
Yes, and we are talking about a mission to the International Space Station, and it's going to be what we call a long-duration mission, a mission of roughly 6 months. And up there, I'm going to be part of a crew of 6 people. It's going to be me and 2 American astronauts and 3 Russian cosmonauts. And for 6 months, we'll be in charge of taking care of the station up there. We'll be the hands and the eyes and the ears of the flight control team on the ground. And we'll take care of the station itself. And we'll try to take care also of all the experiments that scientists all over the world, of course in Europe, but also in the US, in Russia, and in other places, have developed over the course of many years. And so we are the people who get to actually implement them in space.
So you'll be conducting medical and scientific experiment, I understand, right?
Yes, there is a wide range of scientific disciplines that actually have or get a lot of benefits from the opportunity of making experiments in what we call microgravity, or what is sometimes called weightlessness. You basically are able to take away gravity from the environment in space and then see what happens. That might help you, for example, in physics experiments by eliminating some things, like, for example, buoyancy-driven convection does not exist if you don't have the gravitational effect. But then, of course, there are also things that only exist in microgravity, like, for example, the effects on the human body. What happens to the human body when, for 6 months, you're weightless? We, as human beings, in fact, every species on the planet evolved in gravity. And so it's very interesting to see how the body adapts when you take that away.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And that brings me another question. Is there a limit now that you have reached to the limit of astronauts being in the space for a certain amount of time in absence of gravity? Is that those 6 months that you spend up there? Is there a limit, or could you spend even more time if you wanted to?
That's a very interesting question. Actually, the 6 months are not determined by a limitation of the human component. It's actually that the guarantee, let's say, on the space vehicle runs out. We fly to the space station with the Soyuz vehicle, and the manufacturer guarantees that the Soyuz will work for roughly those 6 months. So that's how the crew rotation actually is determined. After 6 months, you have to bring your vehicle home, because you are sure that within that period, your vehicle is going to bring you home safely. But interestingly enough, in 2015, I believe, so in a couple of years, we will have 2 crew members, one Russian and one American, staying on board of the space station for 1 full year. So there's going to be a short duration crew that will take care of rotating the vehicle, of bringing up a fresh Soyuz and bringing down the old one. But those two people will stay on board for what we call 2 increments. And so we will see what happens to them staying in space for 1 year. It's actually not the first time, but for sure now on the space station we have a better way of really observing scientifically what's going to happen in terms of physiological and also psychological adaptations in such a long flight.
So let's say if we were to set a record, it would be like a year up to now, the record that has been set in absence of gravity for the human body?
I think I'm not much of a trivia person. I remember those things not very well, but I think, yes, the longest space flight should have been roughly 1 year.
1 year. And how do you and your crew member prepare for such an event? When does it start? A couple years prior to the mission, or how does it work?
Well, in a way, I guess you prepare for a space flight all your life, because there is so much that you bring into it that is just part of you, your experience and all the skills that you have accumulated throughout your life. But yes, to answer your question more specifically, of course, we enter in what we call the training flow. Roughly, you're right, a couple of years before the flight, depending on whether you're a rookie, so you've never been in space before, or you're somebody who's already a veteran, you're experienced, so some of the stuff that you've done in the past, you don't have to fully repeat, you will just do some proficiency training. So depending where you stand in terms of your previous training and proficiency, it will be a little bit different, but roughly 2 years is pretty much what it takes right now to get ready for 6 months on the station.
So you and your crew member work, I suppose you do as a close team, and you become, you know each other very well in case something that you have to do in space. But what are your, do you talk about when you meet, and I'm sure you meet briefly together to talk about this. What are your expectations, your emotions of thinking of going into something that we're earthlings here, we can only think about and just imagine how it is, but what is it like, the expectation of being put in such a place, and then you will be sent up into space like that? I mean, it has to be something that moves your whole person, your physical realm, and your psychological one too. How do you prepare for that?
Well, I think there are some aspects of spaceflight, as I guess any really very intense experience, that you cannot really imagine until you are really in it. I mean, you can listen to the accounts of other people, but then it is very personal how you will react to some very intense emotional moments, like, you know, the launch, or arriving to the space station, or seeing the Earth for the first time, or just adapting to microgravity. All of those things, I think, have a very personal component. On the other hand, there's also training, and training, those 2 years of training, which is, you know, it's a pretty long time. The purpose of that training is actually to help you make this experience as familiar as possible. So ideally, nothing should be new. Ideally, the training has prepared you perfectly for everything, and you have rehearsed it so many times that nothing really is new. Again, it's somewhere halfway. You know, some things I think will feel familiar because you've been trained so much, but there will still be a component, especially an emotional component, which for sure is very personal, and nothing prepares you for it. And I guess maybe it's nice that it is that way.
Great. And can you describe us how the ISS is inside? Is it possible to know how many rooms? And you told me that you have to exercise at least a couple hours a day. And how is it? Is like a how are the rooms connected? How do you move? How do you sleep there? All because all the things that you do on Earth, you have to be probably able to do that. Also, I have some question here from the children of the Brandolini school here. They ask me, how do you eat? How you manage your food flying around your vehicle?
So there's a lot of really good questions there. So the space station, actually, if I move, you should be able to see a picture of it back there.
Yeah. Yes.
The way it's made, you can imagine it as it's about the size of a soccer field, or I guess maybe a football field as well. And it has like two axes. One axis is this like grid structure that you see there.
Mm-hmm.
That's there mainly to support the solar panels on the two sides. But then this way, it's like a long series of cylinders, I guess. And every one of those cylinders, you can imagine it as like a room in your house. And they're all connected to each other. And you can imagine like one big corridor, like a central corridor that goes from the front to the aft of the space station. So on the aft side, what typically flies as the aft side is the Russian segment. And then as you move forward, you move into a node, and then the United States laboratory, and then another node. And then on this forward side, where you have this node, is called node 2. On the two sides, sticking out like two wings, you have the European laboratory, Columbus, and the Japanese laboratory. And then towards the center, where you have the very first node that was sent up, the node 1, sticking out from the sides, you have 3 cylinders from the side. And one of them is the node 3, and the node 3 is very important for habitation, because for one thing, you have the toilet in there that everybody's always interested in, knowing how that works. But you also have one very important exercise machine. It's called ARID, and that's like the gym. It's like having a little gym in your house. It's like one really complicated machine that has vacuum cylinders and allows you to train as though you were lifting weights in the gym. Of course, weights have no meaning in weightlessness, but with those vacuum cylinders, you can simulate doing your squats, doing your bench press, and so on. And you also have attached to this node a wonderful place, which is called the cupola. It's a very small module, but what's really exciting about it is that it's mainly one big window. I mean, it's many windows, but you can imagine it as like one single big window that allows you to have a free view onto the Earth from one horizon to the other, so you can encompass the full Earth on it. And then going back, on the other side of this central corridor, you have the airlock. And the airlock is another really important place, because that's a small module that we use to go into outer space. If we have to do spacewalks, imagine it, you have to take away all the air from that module, and then you open the hatch and you go out, and you're not losing air, or you're losing very little of it. And then when you come back in, then you repressurize, you put air back into this module, and we call that the airlock. We actually have 2. The Russians have another on the Russian side. And then sticking out towards the bottom, towards the Earth, we have what we call the PMM, or it's also called the Leonardo. And that's a stowage module. It's actually being provided by the Italian Space Agency. So it's a little bit of Italian space. Actually, a lot of the pressurized volume of the space station has been built in Italy.
I see. And so you have most of the time you are in absence of gravity, right? And what is your schedule already prepared on the daily basis? You have a strict schedule that you have to go by, or you just play it by the day as things develops, or you have a very strict schedule of things that you have to do there?
Yes, there is a time, what we call the timeline, and for astronauts on board, it is very important to be on the timeline, to try not to be behind the timeline. So, which means being able to perform all the tasks that the planners have planned for that day. There is some flexibility built into the day, so some tasks you can shift around, And then some other ones are going to be very strict, like you really have to start at 12 o'clock because maybe you need some special support or some special communication equipment that will only be available at that time when it is scheduled. And this very strict schedule is actually only done roughly 1 week ahead. But it is based on a broader, more general schedule that is prepared even before the mission starts. So I don't remember exactly what the deadlines are, but a few months before the mission starts, you already have a rough plan of everything that has to happen in that mission, and then you work your way through month by month, and then week by week. And then, of course, things sometimes change, things might break, things might just not go as fast as you thought, and so there are planners on the ground who take care of rescheduling and adjusting the schedule.
Interesting. What about if somebody gets sick aboard? How you go by that? Is there a doctor in the crew, or are you all prepared for that?
There could be a doctor in the crew. Some astronauts and some cosmonauts are doctors by that profession, but that is not a rule. In fact, I believe on my expedition we will not have a doctor on board at all. But we have at least always 2 crew members who are trained as crew medical officers. So I'm actually going to be one of them. So you get training in any emergency procedures, but also in doing little medical operations. More than a doctor, you will be trained in some nursing skills. You know what a nurse would be able to do, some basic nursing skills. And then, of course, there is a doctor on the ground, on console. So if somebody really gets sick or you have an accident, then you will, as crew member, as crew medical officer, you will operate under the guidance of the surgeon on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Like trying to fly an airplane if you don't know how to do it, if somebody will guide you. But I know you are very familiar with that.
We do get extensive training in performing basic operations. And of course, especially real emergencies like somebody needing CPR, we train a lot. I mean, and the crew has to react really fast in that case. We have a CPR station permanently deployed so that we could strap in a crew member real quick and start giving CPR very quickly.
And your food is just like in the little boxes or the pills, or can you eat a dish of spaghetti up there, or a pizza or something like that? How you go by the food you eat up there?
Well, I think my colleague Luca Parmitano, who is flying in a few months in May, he will have lasagna on board, he will have risotto al pesto, he will have tiramisu, and I've tried those are really good. Those are almost as good as like fresh food. But that's like some special food that was developed in small quantities for him. But otherwise there are about, I believe, 16 menus that rotate throughout the mission. So for 16 days you have something new every day, and then the 17th day you will start again with what you had. And we have mainly American food and Russian food. And then again, as European Space Agency, we provide some bonus food, like, for example, what I was talking about that Luca Parmitano will bring to station. It can be dehydrated, like some are like pouches that you have to attach to the water dispenser, and you just fill them with water, either at ambient temperature or like hot water. And then every little package has instructions that tell you how much water to put in, how long you have to let it sit. So you just follow the instructions, and after that you will have a tasty meal or a tasty dish. Some other meals are just in pouches that are thermostabilized. So you just put them in a little electric oven that we have. It looks like a little suitcase. You put in your pouches, you close it, you let it there for 20, 40 minutes, depending how warm you want it, and then it's ready to be eaten. Some food is just in the natural form, like little snacks or cookies or stuff like that. They're just repackaged, but they're pretty much the same as they would be in the supermarket. Yeah, that's about the main types of food. food. Sometimes you get fresh food when a new vehicle comes up, like a resupply vehicle. It might have some fresh food in it that you have to eat quickly, though, because you have no way of storing it. You cannot just freeze it. So those are the little treats that you get once in a while.
And how are you dressed inside the ISS? Can you be casual, or you have to have a certain type of dress when you are inside?
Yeah, the supplies of clothes are pretty much standards. You have you can say, I think I haven't gone through that process again, but as far as I understand, at some point before you fly, you will get a brief where they will present you what kind of clothing is available, and then you might have some flexibility in deciding, hey, I want more shorts, or I want more long pants, or I want more t-shirts, or I tend to be cold, I want a couple more sweaters, stuff like that. But it's pretty much from whatever is already in the complement.
So the temperature, I believe, is kept equal by, like, if air conditioning, and all your power comes from the solar power, right?
Yes, we are fully green on the space station. So all the power comes from the solar arrays. And of course, it takes some planning and some managing. We have people on the ground who take care of making sure that we always have a good power balance, that we do not consume more than we are producing with the panels. And that's typically not an issue, but sometimes it could be.
How is the waste being taken care of? How do you destroy it with chemicals, or how does it go? All the trash that you
Yeah, that's a very good point. Trash management is a big issue, and basically all those resupply vehicles that come to station to bring goodies, and we have several of them. We have the Russian Progress, we have the Japanese HTV, we have the European Automated Transfer Vehicle. And then recently, we've also had a couple of flights of the Dragon. And we should also have in a near future Cygnus flying. Well, actually, I take it back. All those are resupply vehicles. But the first three I mentioned, the ATV, the HTV, and the Progress, those also serve as trash disposal. Those are all vehicles that burn up at re-entry, so they do not make it to the surface. They burn up destructively in the atmosphere. And so before they leave, we fill them with trash, with everything we want to get rid of, and then they leave, and all the trash burns up with them in the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. I have a question here from Tim Holloway. He says, what kind of attention have you gotten for being the first Italian woman astronaut?
What kind of attention
have you gotten for being the first Italian woman astronaut?
There was some media attention for sure when I was selected, and again when I was assigned to a space flight. Yep, that's it.
And is there an outside mission that you are preparing? Like, are you going for a spacewalk? And if you do, how do you prepare?
I would love to. I would love to, but I don't know. That really depends on the detailed plan for our mission that will be developed at a later time. It is still way too early. So it depends whether there will be a need for a spacewalk during my increment, and then who will be assigned to it. There is also a possibility of doing a spacewalk which is not expected, which is not planned. And that has happened in the past several times already. Because of course things can break, and you might be in the situation where you need to go out and fix them, and you didn't know it ahead of time. So that is what we call a contingency EVA, as opposed to a planned EVA. And EVA is the extravehicular activity, so that's the technical name of a spacewalk. So
for you, it would be like going to the. For you, is the thing that you hope for most.
Yeah. I mean that would be really a
Something
cherry on
everybody would like to do at least one time in their lifetime, right?
yes, I definitely would like to try that, but we'll see.
Which, if it happens, you let us know. And who takes the pictures there? How do you go by photographing? Is that an automatic, or is somebody who takes care of that in the crew?
During a spacewalk?
No, during the entire mission. Is that
The entire
someone
mission?
entirely dedicated to taking picture, or you can
No.
do it as at will? How does it work?
Yes, astronauts are free to take as many pictures as they want. In fact, there are many cameras on board, and typically you even have your own that is assigned to you for the time that you are up there. And it depends. Some astronauts take very, very many pictures. Some take less. It's really a preference thing. And you may take whatever picture you want, of course. But also the Earth observation community, the Earth observation people on the ground, they also have like specific targets for you on the ground to photograph, and they will upload those every day. They will tell you when you will pass above them, and so that you can be in the best conditions to actually catch the target. And so that is planned by the community, but you're also free to take any other picture that you want to take.
Great. And how about, I have a question here from 10 years old. If you have the perception of the light like we do here, do you have the perception of day and night from up there?
Well, the days and nights go by very fast up there because the station goes around the Earth once every 90 minutes. So every hour and a half, you make a full circle around the Earth, and you have a sunrise and a sunset. But of course, inside the station, we don't leave days in 90 minutes pace. That would be difficult. The crew just lives a normal 24-hour day, and it's based on the Greenwich time, the UTC. So the crew just gets up, and the working day starts roughly at 8 o'clock in the morning UTC with a conference with the ground. And I don't know exactly how the crew plays it, but I'm assuming that they have the lights up during the working day, and then at some point they just turn the lights off, and they simulate day and night that way.
So how fast does it travel if it goes around the Earth at 1 hour and a half? It's very fast.
I think it's 28,000 kilometers an hour.
Wow.
Pretty fast.
Of course, you have no perception of that.
No, unless you hit something, and then you will have a very good perception of it. But unless you hit something, it will be fine.
This brings me another question. You hit something. Is there a possibility that you see what happened in Russia today? That there was a meteor shower in Russia. I don't know if you heard the news about. There were.
I read something really quickly. Let's say.
Possibility that a meteor might hit the space lab. Is that a possibility? Or,
that is extremely unlikely. Most of the things that are already in orbit, if they're above roughly a centimeter, are tracked. And so if there is a possibility of a collision with the station, the ground controllers will plan an avoidance maneuver. They will move the station into a slightly different orbit to avoid the possibility of a collision. Now, what happens all the time, and we cannot avoid that, is like impacts of micrometeorites, like really small particles that impact the station at a very high speed. And the way we deal with that is that all the pressurized elements of the station have like protection, like a micrometeorite shield around, so that the impact will never, we hope that you will never have something actually go through the hull and actually make a breach and have a loss of atmosphere. Now, of course, that is one of the scenarios that we train for, that we call emergency scenarios. It's called a rapid depressurization. So if you had, for example, in that case, a micrometeorite actually really breached through the hull, and make us a whole, then that would be something that the crew would have to deal with quickly.
Yeah, it's like being a pressurized airplane, right? Like if an object went through an airplane, it would act like that. If you are pressurized, right? The whole module is pressurized, so it can be punctured, or I see.
Exactly.
How high are you there? How far from the Earth are you up in the sky? How many kilometers?
Not that far. It's actually about 400 kilometers.
400, huh?
Yeah. So it's what we call low Earth orbit.
Low Earth orbit. And what is your view of the other planets from up there? How do you see? Because this was another question from a child here from the school. He say, "How do you see the moon? How do you see Mars?" I would say, I don't know. You answer the question.
I don't know. I'll be able to answer that question better when I've actually been up there.
Yeah, but it should be a different. So you are traveling between the moon and the Earth like in a corridor, or where do you see the moon when you orbit the Earth?
Well, again, you're moving around the Earth very quickly, so the position where you will see the moon will also change very quickly.
According to the position where you are.
Yeah.
Now, I have this question from my daughter Aurora, who is 10 years old. And,
hello, Aurora.
Aurora, and she also asked me if you could say hello to her.
I did. Hello, Aurora.
She say she would like to know when you developed a will of becoming an astronaut. When did the passion started?
I think I was younger than Aurora. I was very young. I always said that I wanted to be an astronaut as a child already, which is the case for most astronauts, actually. Most of us have had this dream for as long as we remember.
So it's something that you grow when you are a child, and it develops slowly into what you are today. And what is your dream as an astronaut? What is the thing that you would like really to do as your goal, as your expectation in the future?
Well, again, on the short term, and I guess it's not really short term, let's call it medium term. So concerning my mission, of course, as I mentioned, I would really, really like to have an opportunity to do a spacewalk. Again, like most astronauts, I'm not very original there. And then if we look on the long term, of course, I would be thrilled if within my career as an astronaut, there will be a possibility of participating in a mission that goes beyond low Earth orbit.
Mm-hmm. I have another question here from Michael Serson. It says, how does the space station stay in one location? What prevents it from floating away? The speed. No?
Well, the space station is in orbit, so it becomes like a satellite. It kind of becomes like the moon in a way. So when you are at a given distance from the Earth, if you have the exact velocity for that distance from the Earth, is what we call the orbital velocity, then you will just stay in that orbit. You will just keep turning around it. Mm-hmm. Let's see how we can explain that. Well, imagine if you, that's an explanation I once heard that I find sometimes useful. Imagine that you were on a really tall building, which is 400 kilometers high, just like the space station's orbit is right now. And you were a really powerful person, and you could take the space station and just throw it. And then you throw it at some point, it falls down on the Earth. And then next time you throw it a little bit faster, and it will fall down on the Earth a little bit faster. And then if you keep throwing it faster and faster, at some point you will throw it, and you will give the space station exactly the orbital velocity for those 400 kilometers. And guess what? It will not fall on the Earth anymore. It will just come back behind you. And then it will make another turn and another turn around the Earth. And that's just being on orbit. Now, that is a little bit simplified. In reality, the altitude of the space station decays in time because, for example, you have some residual atmosphere, you have some residual molecules, atmosphere molecules up there at 400 kilometers. And so that creates some little residual drag. And so that is a factor that makes the space station come down slowly a little bit. So periodically, we actually have to reboost it. We have to bring it back up to whatever altitude we want it to be.
And
was that clear at all?
Sure. I think it's like is it like the game when we were kids? We put a rock on the end of some string, and then we'll turn it like this, and by going like this, the rock will always go in the same direction, right? Somehow.
Somehow, yes. Somehow.
I have another question here. If from Tara Mulder, she says, who inspired you? Who inspired, and who are your heroes?
I don't know. I don't have heroes sticking out to me. I think throughout my life I've had lots of people that I looked up to, but I've never put people on a pedestal, like saying, they're like heroes. I've tried to learn from everybody something, but yeah, I don't really have anybody that I would say that's my hero. In a way, everybody teaches you something, and everybody has something inspiring that you can take with you. And at the same time, everybody has limits. We're all human beings. And so I think it's an act of kindness to people not to put them onto a higher pedestal, because it's a very uncomfortable position for anybody to be in. Again, we're all human beings, and I've met many human beings that had great things to teach me and who are very inspiring, but all human beings.
One more question I have from Michael Serson. It says, without air friction in space, how can the booster adjust to the position?
Okay, without air friction in space, how can the booster
adjust the position?
Maybe he can specify a little bit. I don't quite. Okay, maybe he's asking how we change the altitude.
You correct how do you correct the position if you were to correct it? Do you have a directional booster or something like that can
correct? Yes. There are a series of like little small rocket engines around the station that can, depending which ones you fire, you will impart a torque on the space station and you will turn it. So that's how we do it. I'm trying to think about the friction question. Maybe he's thinking about the way we change attitude for airplanes, where you actually need the aerodynamic effect of the air to actually move the attitude of an airplane. So that's why in space we use rockets. You don't actually need, control surfaces like you have on an airplane. You actually use the effect of these small rockets and how you position them around your space station, for example, and then you will be able to impart exactly the torque that you need to turn it in one direction or the other.
Great.
Which is what we did a couple of days ago for the Progress docking. Progress had to dock to the station, and then we just turned it about 90 degrees to help the Progress dock.
During the day, do you have a free time? And if you do you bring books up there? What do you do in your free time? Like, I mean, here we can go to the movie, we can go, but what does an astronaut do in the space when he has free time?
It depends on, different people do different things. Some people just like to look out of the window. Some people as we mentioned, like to take a lot of pictures. Some people watch movies, some people listen to music or read books. Some people like to do extra experiments, for example. There is a thing called voluntary science, where you can volunteer some of your free time to do more scientific experiments, or even your own experiments. If you want to make some kind of demonstrations of physical effects in microgravity, you can do that. You can call home. We have an IP phone, or you can call anybody for that matter. We have an IP phone that allows you to call anybody, just like from your home. We have the family conferences on the weekends typically, so there are like scheduled, allocated times where you can actually have a video conference with your family and be able to actually see them, and they will see you. Those are some of the things you can do. But yes, of course, you cannot just leave. That's for sure.
This brings me to a more personal question I didn't ask before. What about family? Are you married? You have children? How is your private life? If you want to talk about, or you can just keep the question.
No, I typically do not talk about my private life. I can tell you that I do not have children, but beyond that.
Okay, great. We'll skip to the next question then.
All right.
I have a question here from Alexander Sanchez de Miguel, and he asked me if I could make the question in Spanish. I'm sure you...
I don't speak Spanish, unfortunately.
Okay, I'll do it in English then, and I will translate it for... ¿Qué futuro? He asks, what future do you think is there over the light contamination? It says our planet is a lot of light contamination. How do you see that in the future? I'm going to put that in Spanish 1 second.
No, it's not really.
It's not. It doesn't have anything to do with.
It's not my field of expertise. Okay. I really don't know.
We stick to the other question. So, you think that the future of the space exploration will lead the human beings to go and live and maybe going to explore Mars? Like I was looking. Couple of weeks ago, there was a project of some colonizations of Mars, something like that. That sounds really kind of fantastic, but how do you see the future in space exploration?
Well, I think a way of looking at this question is like by trying to imagine for ourselves humanity in like 500 years or 1,000 years or whatever future reference works for you. And I think if you do that, you will find it really, really difficult to imagine human civilization in this future time still constrained to our beautiful but little planet. I think we all instinctively perceive that the future is an expansion of the space where we have access to, where we live, where we exploit the resources. So assuming that is true, then I think it's just a question of making the steps. And the space station is a really good starting point, because it means that for the past 12 plus years now, we've had permanently human beings on orbit. So we have learned to operate on orbit in space permanently, and to operate as this international endeavor, which is the International Space Station, which is very complex. It's not only complex from an engineering point of view, but it's also very complex from an operational point of view, because it's such an international endeavor, and that is what makes it strong, and that's what makes it robust, and that's also what makes it complex. So that is a really, really good starting point to, in the next years and decades, make the next steps, so that at some point in the future, we are a multiplanetary species. So that's what I believe personally.
And that brings me to another couple of questions very quickly. Do you believe in there is a life, other forms of life in the universe? And if you do, being that the space is so wide as we could never think how wide it is there a way that we could overcome our limit of velocity and travel to a point where we could travel the universe so fast that we can reach the outer limits of the infinite?
Well, first of all, about the question of life, I think that is really, I don't think we should make it a question of belief, like do we believe in it or do we not believe in it? It's a question of asking the question. I mean, it's an open question. I don't know the answer. Nobody knows the answer. So what's important is keeping it in mind as a question and working to find the answer, as we do, for example, by looking very actively for Earth-like planets in the universe. Now, of course, how we can overcome the big distances, that I believe is a question of technology. And personally, I believe that as long as we remain a species characterized by imagination and by curiosity and by ingenuity, as we are as human beings, there is no preset limit to what we can potentially do as we develop our technological capabilities. So I don't know the technological solutions now, but I am faithful that at some point they will come.
Great. So I think before we go, if you could say, possiamo dire qualche parola in italiano e salutare anche i nostri amici italiani che ci ascoltano?
Volentieri. Spero che comunque siano riusciti a seguirci anche se abbiamo parlato in inglese e non so, magari la prossima volta lo faremo in italiano. Comunque grazie a tutti di averci seguito e tanti auguri a tutti.
E un'ultima cosa, volevo veramente ringraziarti col cuore per aver accettato il mio invito a questa intervista. Per me è stato un immenso regalo che mi hai fatto. And thank you, Samantha, for being with me tonight. You really gifted me with this interview, and it was very, very interesting for me to listen to your mission. And of course, we will be keeping our eyes up in the sky, and we'll keep looking at all the sites that NASA and ESA have. I see every day they have wonderful information about space. As a matter of fact, I know there is a hangout from the ISS coming up next week, and that will be wonderful to watch.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for the very interesting questions. And again, let's try and do this again. Why not? Thank you.
Ciao, ciao, grazie. Ciao, ciao. Bye, bye.